First thing first, I sent everybody a class email from Dr. Zach Petrie of LSU. It's a form for information for those of you that may or may not know. LSU Shreveport is starting a satellite campus here in Lafayette. You don't have to go to Shreveport except for graduation. So you can literally go to PT school here in Lafayette through LSU Shreveport. Usually the new programs, and I think they're starting soon, like their first cohort is the early 2026. And so the first classes are always the best odds to get in because people don't know about it yet. So just if that's an option for you, I sent a link to a mailing list info thing on for this. Next order of business. Let's go to morning. Let's finish up, and then we're going to apply. So, the whole knee internal, external rotators when the knee is flexed thing. You ever seen, my son and I were watching these lumberjacks that compete in different lumberjack events, and one of them was like a log roll. It was crazy. Like they're basically trying to see who can balance on the log while the log is rolling in the water. Right? Has anybody ever seen that before? All right. So what I'd like for you to imagine is if this was a log, muscles that are on the medial side are trying to roll the log internally, and muscles on the lateral side are trying to roll the log laterally when the knee is flexed. So your medial crossing knee muscles, so all of those rotation arrows that are medial, that means this one's pulling the tibia medial, and there's only one that's lateral. So in other words, all these medial crossing muscles, when the knee is flexed, here's our log on the water, and all of these medial crossing muscles are trying to roll the log this way. And then you have your lateral crossing biceps femoris, that's this big tendon right here. That's the only one that's lateral, so it's trying to roll the log this way. So you have your medials, you have your lateral. And then I mentioned last class, the reason you have so many medials is because muscles don't just influence motion, they're there for stability as well. And when we cut and plant, the famous cut and plant, do you remember from 310 that illusion? When you cut and plant, it looks like your knee is internally rotating, but remember from 310, that's lateral external rotation. Absolutely, it's externally rotating with a lot of force. So what can we do to try to make sure it doesn't go too far? And that's have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 medial pullers for stability to be like, you can go, but don't go too far, we're going to tear everything. Right? So your medial internal rotators are mostly there to try to prevent hyper external rotation when you cut and torque that knee laterally. Does that make sense? So we have for knee function, rectus femoris, vastus medialis, intermedius, lateralis are knee extensors. Popliteus, knee flexor, knee internal rotator when the knee is flexed. Gracilis insertorius, knee flexors, knee internal rotators, knees flexed. Membranosus tendinosus, knee flexors, medial rotators when the knee is flexed. Biceps femoris, knee flexor, external rotator when the knee is flexed. See the pattern. And then the gastrocnemius, what's cool about the gastrocnemius is it's not trying to, the way it crosses, it's not trying to spin it's not trying to rotate at all. Its pull is longitudinal from here to the heel. It's not pulling on the tibia or the fibula. It's literally going straight down to the heel, so that's why it has a twisty. That's why it's not trying to spin the wall on the wall. how would we, before we get into some more practical examples, what would be the best way totally, any joint goes, to stretch the biceps femoris? What would we want to do? What positions would we want to make sure we're in if we're really trying to get lengthen this as much as possible? What position would we want to put our knees? We want to be extended, absolutely. What position would we want to put our hip? It's all I'm asking. What about sartorius? What positions would we want to put our joints to make sure we get it stretched out? And so again, these stretch questions, it's a process. All right, well, what does it do? How does it pull? And if we know how it pulls, then we know what positions we have to use. So the sartorius does what at the hip? It's flexion puller, right? It's a flexor, so we want to make sure we extend the hip. What does it do at the knee? It's a flexion puller, right? So we want to make sure the knee is extended. That's how we do it. Okay. What about the rectus femoris? If we really wanted to stretch that rectus femoris. Perfect. Yeah, we want to make sure that hip is extended, and we want to make sure that knee is flexed. Now, here's a nuanced question. My range of motion is, the rectus femoris is going to be a limiting factor to my range of motion when it's super tight. In other words, if I'm extending my hip and flexing my knee, I won't be able to flex my knee as much. Does that make sense? Because my rectus is like, dude, I'm at the end of my rope here. Does that make logical sense? So what I'm saying is that if you were trying to stretch the other quad muscles, you'd probably want to put your rectus on slack. Does that make sense? In other words, don't extend the hip, flex the hip, and then you can flex your knee more to stretch out the vastoid muscles. Because if I'm extending my hip and flexing my knee, there's no way I'm getting as much knee flexion because my rectus is my limiting factor to my range of motion. That's what we're doing. Make sense? Okay. Let's go into these a little bit. All right, guys. Has anybody ever seen, this is a physiology thing, but it plays into mechanics. Has anybody ever seen the length tension relationship of sarcomeres of the, okay. See if I could get this. All right. So we know that inside the muscle, we got the little cilia, the little actin, the myosin. I am team, I'm on team. The little actin and myosin, if you're at resting length, and all resting length means is the length that your muscle is in a majority of your life. Resting length, in other words, if I put my arm in a sling, my muscle will produce a new resting length because of the new position that my muscle is in. It's slack. That's why your muscle's stiff when you get out of the sling, because it really just established a new resting length and ate itself up in series so that it could get all the proprioception and all the stuff at the position it's in a majority of its life. At this position, resting length, the actin and the myosin have optimal overlap, optimal interaction. In other words, all the oars are in the water because you never know when you're going to need it. Okay. When you shorten from resting length, that's when those things start to overlap and you don't get as much full force, if you remember. And when you lengthen from resting length, that's when the oars get out of the water, they get pulled apart. What I want to talk to you about is the rubber band stuff, the stuff that I hinted on last time. If a rubber band is laying at resting length, the rubber band isn't trying to pull, it's already eaten up its slack, it's just laying there. As soon as we start stretching the rubber band from its rest, it starts building up and building up and building up tension. And that's all this graph is showing you. Once we start stretching something, the rubber band properties go up exponentially. The rubber band property, what are the rubber band properties? The tendons, that's inert rubber band stuff. All that fascia. Do you remember having to learn in biology like the endomysium, perimysium, ectomysium, dellcomycium, all of this stuff? That's all inert, stretchy rubber band-like materials. So when I tell you longer is stronger, this is what I'm talking about. The rubber band properties spiral up. And you need it because if the contractile components are going to start to go down, you need something to take up that slack. Thankfully, it's the rubber band stuff. In addition, this is the stuff that really gets frayed in the rope. Like, in other words, when you have delayed onset muscle soreness, when you're sore, when you do a muscle biopsy, you don't have broken myosin heads. There's nothing broken there. All of the damage is with the rubber band-like materials. Which again makes sense because as your contractile components go down because they're overlapping or getting pulled apart, dun, 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 the rubber band stuff comes in to save the day. So let's apply this. Let's do a single joint exercise. So guys, one of the things I'm trying to do with this lesson is you have teachers who are physiologists. I call them wizards because they're dealing with cells and molecules. I don't know, it's magic to me. If I can't see it, I'm like, that's sorcery. And then you have cavemen like myself who just, all I know is F is equal to ma. But it makes sense that there has to be some merging between the physiological and the biomechanical. And that's what I'm trying to teach you guys with today's lesson. When you're doing hamstring curls, first of all, we know that you're working more than just your hamstrings, even though your hamstrings are primary muscles. There's other muscles there too. But I want you to notice, as we flex, as those knee flexors shorten and shorten and shorten, physiologically, their pull is going to get less and less and less. Their potential to pull, because as you curl, first of all, you're losing any kind of rubber band stuff that you have as you get to the end of the flexion range of motion, and you're having the overlap of the actin and the myosin. Your potential to physiologically pull gets less and less and less. But we know that you feel very strong in a flexed position. And that's because you trade off from the physiological going down to the biomechanical going up. Follow me here, or try to. I'm going to try to follow myself. Remember how I told you when your legs are in anatomical position or they're straight, you have to have a special muscle to unlock you because those other knee flexors don't really have much moment. A lot of stability, but not a lot of rotary in an extended position. As we flex our knees, we get more and more and more flexion pull. We get more and more and more torque. We get more and more rotary component down here than we did out here. Out here, we hardly had any rotational pull. Out here, we hardly had any moment, rotary component. So how cool, as our physiological force goes down, it gets compensated by our mechanical rotary component going up. That's really cool. That's why we feel so strong in a flexed position, even though those muscles are shorter and their physiological pull went down. I have a much greater moment arm here than I did way over here. My rotary component down here is actually less.
which is awesome because when my rotary component goes down, luckily I get some compensation by the elastic properties instead of going up to compensate. It's really cool. So physiologic, the muscle contribution to the pull is going to get less and less and less as it's shorter, but the torque is going to get greater and greater and greater as a compensation for it. Now let's look at a multi-joint. Let's look at a squat. Follow me here. Follow me here. Oh, that didn't work out. Guys, what I'm about to talk about, I don't know, it's one of my favorite things. The body is incredible. All right. Why do we have so many muscles, especially in our lower extremity, that cross multiple joints? You know, why do we play that game? Why doesn't we just have, each joint has its own muscles that just cross that joint? Why drift off into other areas? There's a few reasons for that. But one of the most elegant, beautiful ways to see how this works, we know we're working knee extensors, right? And we know we're working hip extensors around here. One of our knee extensors crosses the hip, but it's a hip flexor, not a hip extensor. 3 of our hip extensors cross the knee, but they're knee flexors, not knee extensors. So in other words, agonist here, antagonist here, same muscles. Agonist here, antagonist here. It's good. When we talked about stretching muscles, we say, okay, if a muscle crosses the hip and the knee, and I shorten it at the hip, it's going to put slack in the muscle, right? The hamstring curl, the uniaxial exercise made it very simple. As I flex the knees, the muscle is going to be put more on slack. I mean, it's still going to pull, but it's going to be put on slack. So what happens when you have a multi-articular muscle, as the person is coming up and extending the knee and extending the hip, the rectus femoris is shortening at the knee. And thus, its rubber band-like properties, in theory, if all it did was shorten at the knee, like when I do this exercise, I get rubber band energy, I lose rubber band energy. I get, I lose, I get, I lose. Imagine though, if I'm moving the hip and the knee at the same time. As I lose at the knee, I gain some rubber band at the hip. Let me try to say that in a few more ways. One of the brilliance of multi-articulating muscles is as a muscle is shortening on one end, having its other end be able to be lengthened helps keep tension on the muscle that you normally wouldn't have if it just did this. Watch what's happening. You got to have an open mind. Let's pretend, because that band kind of sucks. Let's pretend I had a TheraBand. You know what a TheraBand is, right? If all I did was move my knee, like in the first exercise, my tension would get less, my tension would get more. Rubber stretch, not stretch. But what could happen if, as I'm shortening this end, I could somehow lengthen the other end. Wouldn't the rubber band tension be kept? That's what I'm talking about. So as you shorten distally, you lengthen proximally, and it helps maintain some of that rubber band property throughout the range of motion. As you shorten proximally, you lengthen distally, and it helps maintain some of that rubber band-like property.
Well, I understand the concept, but what determines or what dictates whether one flexes or the other extends?
Everything. What a great question. Everything. In biomechanics, now obviously I'm saying that in general, and we're going to focus it down. In biomechanics, we call it the sum of all the different things. Your bank account, you get a statement every month, let's say. What determines whether you saved money or lost money? The sum of all the transactions, right? There's a lot of transactions you do every month, and it's not any one transaction, it's the sum of all the transactions. So let's look at it. Beautifully drawn to scale. My therapist, hamstrings at the knees have some importance for preventing ACL injuries. You ever heard that before, right? The hamstring pulling on the lower leg, pulling on the tibia, checking the tibia. It's kind of neat. It's kind of a neat side effect. For the hamstrings to be hip extensors, you have to pull on the lower leg. Pull it on something. Muscles can only pull. They pull on bones. Bones can push. So in other words, first thought experiment. If I take something at my lower leg and do this with it, that would affect motion here, here, and there. Make sense? If this was balanced and this was the only force, and I did this would move, and that would move. True? So, in addition, mobility and stability, in addition to the nice little extra we get by the hamstrings checking the tibia, really those hamstrings are trying to pull this lower leg, and by pulling it in a direction of hip extension, you're actually also pulling in a direction of knee extension. It's magic of closed chain. Now, we don't say that these are knee extensors, but looking at it holistically. When I said all, that's what I meant. Let's look at something else. What's that little bone right there? Patella. The quad is pulling the patella on the top and the bottom. There's your quad, vastus lateralis, medialis, intermedius, rectus femoris, pulling the top part of the patella up, and your quad, there's your quad tendon, there's your patella tendon. Imagine a bow and arrow. The strings pull, but aren't the strings pushing the knock forward? Yeah. So what's happening is, here's our bow and arrow, here's the knob, and literally this is driving the patella into the distal femur, pushing your knee into extension. The muscles don't push, but they pull on bone, and bones push. Why do you think so many people have patella pain? Patella. Put your hand on your patella and do this. You feel clicking and grinding? It's because literally your quad is pushing your patella into your knees to help you extend your knees. And if this moves, and that has to move in closed chain. They have to move together. It's one system. Everything is helping. Oh, but wait, there's more. When we get to our ankle muscles, if I grabbed on to the lower leg and pulled like this, wouldn't that also affect this and this? Absolutely. Have you ever stopped to think, like, how in the world can someone squat 1,000 pounds? Because there's no wasted muscle when you close chain. Because it's a hydraulic lift. Muscles that technically don't cross the knee because you're weight bearing, because you're close chain, muscles that are pulling down here indirectly move up the chain. Muscles that are pulling here, like your gluteus maximus is only pulling on your feet, right? But if this moves, guess what else has to move? So they're all working together. So it's the sum of all of those parts. And the brilliance of it too is that friction is preventing you from flexing. Friction is incredible. So when you're doing these squats and this guy's trying to make your knee do this, but friction is preventing it so. And then you have other muscles like this is trying to make your knee do this. So this one trying to flex it and this one trying to extend, you cancel each other out. That's why when you're weight bearing and you jump, you know the sum of all those different torques have to be 0 so that I could go straight up. So they all cancel each other out angularly so that they can work together summatively.
Better doing that.
Exactly. Exactly. Think of it like this. If you were perfect, to show you the effects of friction, if you tried to do that squat on roller skates, but as you're going down, you don't notice it, but friction's trying to make you do stuff. And if your muscles can work chef's kiss perfectly, those things cancel and you should be able to do a squat on roller skates. If all the muscles are firing the way they should fire, you should have equal flexion and extension distally. And then once those things are anchored, then they can move everything up the hydraulic chain together. They're all working together. But going back to the original point, which love that question. No, go on, Pop. I'll let y'all know what's in the on the test. Guys, college should be about stimulating your mind. So please. Injuries, so we have to talk about different injuries. If we're talking about musculoskeletal stuff by themselves, muscles get damaged, whether it's micro damage, delayed onset, or tears because they're being pulled apart. The rope is going to fray when it's being pulled apart, not when it's short. So eccentrics is when you're going to have damage because it's being pulled apart. But if you're doing, if let's look at the squat. As I'm flexing my knees, I'm flexing my hips. So as my rectus is lengthening at the knee, it's shortening at the hip. As it's shortening at the knee, it's lengthening at the hip. And that's okay because we're getting stored stretchy stuff. As one side shortens and I'm going to lose my rubber band, the other side's lengthening so I keep my rubber band. Does that make sense? Now, in terms of like ligamentous injuries, there's stuff you just can't avoid. Car wrecks, crashes, someone lands on outside. But sometimes a lot of injuries are because muscles are tired, your nerves are tired, and they don't fire to prevent hypermobility. That's why like the research is very clear that when you're tired, you make mistakes. You go to get some cereal and you go to put the cereal box in the refrigerator. Because it's late, you're tired. It's the same thing with your body. You're going to punt, you've done it a million times, but your body's exhausted. And when your hamstrings were meant to turn on to slow down, maybe they turned on a little too late, maybe they turned on a little too early, maybe you went to cut and plant and some of those medial rotators were a little late to the party, or maybe they didn't get turned on at all. And you go to cut and plant and that knee does. And then you say, well, I've done it 1,000 times. Why all of a sudden this one time I tore my ligaments? It's because your muscles who were supposed to be on duty were a little late to the point. So those kind of things can happen too. But yeah, damaged muscles are being pulled apart. All right, so let's go to some applicable practice. All right, guys, let's start off with this one. Right hip. She starts in this position. So let's say she starts in an isometric, holding this position. And then from there, her leg. Now I'm using layman's terms so that you can practice Uber kinesiology through. Okay? So she starts in this position. And she lowers her leg down. We should be able to identify specific muscles and through which specific contraction. Who moved it and how did it move? She starts here, so she's holding this isometrically for the picture. You know? Okay, hold it. All right, we got the picture. And then from there, she's going to lower it down. Now, is there any reason for her to go faster than gravity? No. Is there any reason to just let gravity plug it down? So those are the kind of things. And then after we do a few of these logical muscles working in opposite direction of external forces, we'll do some practical things like that. Sometimes just like slow, right? Sometimes like you're like, hey, gravity, get it. Sometimes you have to go faster than what gravity can offer. There's some functional reasons. We'll do some of those today as well. So I want to know muscles influence the motion. So when she lowers her leg down, you should know what motion that is through a specific type of contraction. And hopefully my students, the takeaway from all this is you will not ever have to guess contraction. I'm trying to show you that contraction is solved. It's like you would solve for any basic equation. Gravity's trying to do what to her hip? Add the deduct. So she doesn't need adductors or that thing would flop down, right? She needs hip abductors. Who are those muscles? You can learn them however you want to learn them. I just need us to know them. Who are the abduction pullers? Tensor fascia lata is an abduction puller. Gluteus medius and minimus is an abduction puller. And our piriformis is an abduction puller. Cool. Now, those abduction pullers can do adduction when they're working eccentrically. They can also cause abduction. They're working concentrically. They can hold that position isometrically. Same muscle. Do another one, then we'll get to a cracker. Left hip. What would be the prime movers, the major muscles in the contraction that brought her leg up? I just want to make sure you don't answer. Let's see. I want to know which muscles in the type of contraction draw our leg up for the
Yes, that's the finished position.
Correct. I didn't want to do the C. All that mixed up. Yeah, that's the finished position. Not that she's from Finland. It's her finish. Finish. And, you know, it's right. Gravity's trying to do what to the hips? Abduct. So we need adductors. Who are our adductors? Absolutely, gracilis, and then the adductor magnus, longus, and like I said, I love the adductors because they have the tool in their name. I wish all the muscles had their tool in their name. The key thing, though, is that just because it says adductor doesn't mean it's always going to do adduction. When it's working eccentrically, it can do abduction. All right, let's level up.
Hi, Sam.
Yeah, I like this. I just want to see video. That's good. Man. Okay, we're going to look at his left hip. And what we know is the left hip is just going to cycle between, we're going to start big and we're going to funnel it down. His left hip is really just cycling between flexion and extension. Flexion, extension, flexion. Okay. What speeds up must slow down. If I'm shuffling to the right, before I go to the left, I got to slow down my motion this way so that I can speed up my motion that way. So going down the rabbit hole, we have flexion, extension, but we have to speed up the flexion, slow down the flexion. And we got to speed up the extension. We got to slow down the extension. That takes muscles, but it also takes contractions. Okay. Now, when here's here, see if I can get a good stop. Perfect. In this position, once he starts coming down, yeah, gravity could extend his hip, but gravity, although it's consistent, is not a very strong force, guys. Gravity doesn't give you, it's a pesky son of a gun that's always there, but newborn babies could beat gravity. I mean, it's really not that strong. I mean, I'm not saying newborn babies can, do this, but they can move their hands against it, and it doesn't take them too long to be able to beat gravity. So does it make sense that even though gravity is trying to extend his hip, I don't want to use my flexors to do extension eccentrically? I'm going to come out last. It makes sense that I actually want to use muscles that pull in the same direction as gravity because I'm trying to make extension happen faster than what gravity can offer by itself. Does that make sense? So speeding up hip extension is going to be my hip extensors do concentric contraction, even though gravity is trying to extend me because I'm trying to make my shoulder go faster than this. Well, in this case, my hip. That's not a lot. Makes sense? All right. So speeding up the hip extension, we agree hip extensors do concentric contraction. What speeds up must slow down. So can the same muscles that sped up my hip and extension push it to a stop? No, muscles can only pull. So when it comes time to slowing down hip extension, I'm going to turn off my hip extension pullers and turn on my hip flexion pullers. And those hip flexors are going to slow down the extension through what type of contraction? Flexors put on the brakes of extension for eccentrics. They're going to keep pulling to change my direction and then speed up the flexion. That's what we call a plyometric sequence, if you remember from 310. It's a sequence where something pulling in one direction can do two things back to back: slow down motion one way and speed up motion the other. In 310, I use this cart as an example of this concept. 310, I said, guys, if all I can do is pull, once I create motion, I can't influence it the other way. But if the cart is rolling away from me and I pull, I could slow it down going away from me, change its direction and speed it up coming to me. Remember that? So that's a plyometric sequence. So the hip flexors are going to slow down the extension through eccentrics, change your direction, and speed up the flexion through concentrics. Something's got to slow down the flexion. We could let gravity do it, but again, gravity is very limited. So the best way to slow down my flexion as fast as possible, put on the brakes, is to turn off my flexors and turn back on the extensors. And we're back to the original part. Extensors are going to slow down the flexion through eccentrics, change my direction, speed up the extension through concentrics. My flexors are going to slow down the extension through eccentrics, change my direction, speed up the flexion through concentrics. Now, all of this is happening fast. Turn on, turn off, turn on, turn off, turn on. And when you're tired, that's when you make mistakes, going back to your original point. You're exhausted, you've been up all day, you've been working all day, and all of a sudden something turns on too soon or too early or doesn't turn on at all. Well, it's not exactly, yes on the rubber band, but it's a different mechanism. We're trying, when I say we're trying to slow down the flexion, we're trying to slow down the whole leg, right? So in this example, my hamstrings are getting longer at the hip, but as I extend the knee, they're getting longer at the knee as well. So I'm doing this, which is really great for trying to put on the brakes. Make sense? It also makes sense why you would probably tear something more when you're stretching the rubber band at both ends. It's like burning the candle at both ends. So let's take a look at that hip flexion and knee extension going on. Watch. See it? It's stretching at both ends, which is really great for putting on the brake. Here's something I wish I knew when I was younger. The limiting factor to how fast someone can be is not your extensors, it's your flexors. Let me explain why. There is no correlation, like if you think about it, someone who does a high vertical jump, those people aren't always fast. In our brains, it's like, well, why wouldn't they be fast? They're powerful and you're using your extensors, why wouldn't they be fast? The limiting factor is frequency. For lack of a better term, if we were in the Wild West and I had a contest to see like who's the fastest draw and who can shoot the 6-shooter as fast as I can. You ever seen some of those trick shooters that do on their hands in the old West movies? The limiting factor is how fast can you recock your hip? Because remember, this is frequency. The limiting factor isn't this, it's how fast can I recock it in order to do that again? Does that make sense? So fast people typically have fast hip flexors because to get from point A to B for them, they do it in less time than the other one. So their frequency is much higher. That's kind of cool. All right, last one. I got you for 5 minutes. Last one. Let's do the smushy bug exam. Oh, I'm sorry, it's the bug, but you got to go. All right, so here's the scenario. Bug is on the ground, and we have options. This is just going to be a hip conversation, okay? We analyze motion joint by joint. We analyze muscles joint by joint. So we're going to have a hip conversation. Bug is on the ground. And let's say we already start in a flexed position. Your options are, if you're trying to take care of the bug, your options are isometric. It's not going to take care of the bug. Flexors eccentric or extensors concentric. See what I'm getting at? Absolutely. Because every now and then there's a functional reason to use muscles in the same direction as gravity. A majority of our life, we don't do it. A majority of life, our muscles work in opposition. But every now and then, you know, even athletes, how much of your time do you spend actually running? Even professionals, like it's a small fraction of time. Majority of our lives, our muscles are working in opposition of gravity or external forces. But every now and then, we got to hit the nail with the hammer. Every now and then, we got to move faster than gravity. Every now and then, we got to kill the mosquito. That was the 310 example. You have a mosquito on your leg, you're probably not going to do flexors eccentrically. Concentric in the same direction because there's a practical reason. Make sense? All right, guys, have a good one.